Welcome to Seattle Voices. I'm Eric Liu. I'm just thrilled to have as my guest today Frank Chopp, Speaker of the House of Representatives here in Washington State. Frank, welcome.
Yeah, thanks. It's great to be here.
So Speaker of the House, tell me just briefly, what is a single day in the life of the Speaker of the House like, if there's such a thing as a typical day?
Really, it's not typical. It's a year-round job. It's not just for the legislative session. A big part of my job is to help form our agenda for the legislative session. So I work constantly with legislators and a lot of stakeholder groups to develop a very progressive agenda for the next session, trying to figure out legislation to pass or budget items. At the same time, I also got to make sure we do everything we can to build our constructive majority. So that means recruiting candidates, working campaigns, and getting out and meeting lots of people all over the state.
You've been Speaker for how many years now?
It's 9 going on 10.
And so when you think back to your mindset prior to becoming Speaker, how much of this job has been just as you expected it, and how much of it has been nothing remotely like you expected?
Well, I didn't expect to get in the job so soon. I was there just for 4 years, and then there was a big shift there in 1998 in an election. So I got put into this position, and it was a very steep learning curve. But the key, though, is to just learn from your mistakes, because you make tons of them, and then keep working and doing better each time. And it's just built up to the point where I feel very, very good about the momentum that we have.
Now, you know, there's that simple line you just said is actually something that there are a lot of folks in public life in elective office who don't operate this way, which is you learn from your mistakes, right? I mean, I think it's something about the nature of politics is people want to.
I wasn't supposed to admit that.
No, you weren't supposed to admit that.
Oh my
You're
God.
totally off message here.
Oh, no.
But people don't like to, in public life, necessarily admit their mistakes or admit them as mistakes. Who was it who formed for you the sense of if you make a mistake, you admit it, you move on, and you try to learn from it? Where does that come from for
Well,
you?
after making a few mistakes, and then you have your choice. Either you apologize and try to do better, or you try to be defensive. Let me tell you, it's much better to apologize and do better next time. In fact, I joke I spend about 15% of my time apologizing for things, whether it's my fault or not. And so I just find that it's a great relaxer of people, because if you're really focused in on everybody doing better, whoever is involved, then you set the right tone so that people can learn from what they've done, figure out new ways of being structured, for example, or new ways of approaching an issue, so that everything actually improves over time. I'm finding that with countless examples, that's made a real difference.
Now, you're Speaker in an era when, you know, party unity, party discipline is harder than ever probably to manage. I mean, this is true at a state level, it's certainly true at a national level. Do you think being Speaker and trying to get Democrats organized as Democrats as a bloc is a much tougher row to hoe today than it would have been, say, 25 years ago, 50 years ago?
50 years ago, I was 4 years old, I'm not sure. So I think, though, that basically what I think the public wants is somebody who's looking out for the interests of the state, statewide. So we work very hard on our theme as House Democrats, which is working together for one Washington. And we talk about one Washington a lot because we really want the entire state to move forward. So when you have that kind of one Washington theme, it's a unifying theme. For example, one of the things that we're most proud of is our agriculture agenda. That's the ag agenda. And one of our members, Eric Pettigrew from the 37th District, which doesn't have any farms in it, is one of the leaders in that effort. So we try to figure out ways for people to work together and cross those divides. You know, it used to be people talked about I think they call it the Cascade Curtain, and that, some parties, I should say the other side of the aisle, basically likes to pit one group versus the other, east versus west, urban versus rural, and we say enough of that. What the public wants is for us to try to work together, which is not only the right thing to do, but it's also very good politics, because it appeals to the better judgments of everybody.
You mentioned Eric Pettigrew. One of the things he's done as well, maybe in the context of that agriculture work, is develop working relationships with members and colleagues from the other party, not just from other parts of the state. And I'm wondering for you, I mean, that's got to be a tension at all times. On the one hand, you want to get stuff done as Speaker. You want to make things move. On the other hand, as you said earlier, you want to build a majority. You don't want to necessarily give the opposition party or the other party opportunities to share in the
What do you mean?
in
We
the
do it all the
creation
time. We do it all the time. That's good policy, because a lot of times the other folks on the other side of the aisle will have some ideas, and then by working together, what are they going to complain about? So there's a way of moving the state forward in a positive way that produces better policy for the citizens of our state, and also, it engenders success. People like that. If you can get something done, that's a much better approach than fighting and not getting anything done. So we have one of the best records in state history of not only having a positive and progressive agenda, but actually getting done on time. Mm-hmm. You look at other states around the country, and Lord, they're going into special sessions this, special sessions that, going on most of the year. When we got our job done, we moved on and went back to the next preparation for the next session.
Do you think in this day and age, the idea of a citizen legislature where people work serve part of the year and then go back to their other lives and other jobs is still sustainable, or do you feel like it's actually become an all-dominating, all-consuming job?
I may be the only legislator who feels this way, but I believe in a citizen legislature. I think it's the best thing to do. It keeps you grounded in the real world. I mean, if you're out there running a small business where you got to meet payroll or be responsive to your customers, that's much better than if you're just isolated in just a legislative job over time. And so we really seek to recruit people for the legislature who have a lot of real world experience. At the same time, they've got to have one foot in the real world and one foot in the legislature.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. For you, when you first decided to run, when you won election in 1994, what was it that led you to think, I ought to do this? Because you've been working for many years as a community activist, organizer, Fremont Public Association, other things, and you were making a tangible difference in a lot of people's lives there. What led you to say, I ought to do this because this would be more meaningful, or this would be meaningful?
Well, it basically is where the action is. If you look at public policy in the state of Washington, it's the legislature, as opposed to some local city council, which is important. But in terms of the issues I cared about, whether it be education or health care or helping poor people, the legislature is where it's at. And so I said, well, I've had some success. In fact, the best learning experience I had was as coordinator of the Seattle food banks for a couple of years there, many years ago. I really learned how to get people who essentially don't necessarily have a common interest, you might think. You might think they would be, but when there's a limited resources, and if one food bank gets more money or more food than another, it's essentially a mini legislature. And I learned a lot from that example. But the key was to help build the pie or grow the pie so that every food bank felt like they were getting what they needed to help poor people. And so I learned a lot from that example and countless others since then.
Huh. When was that you were doing the food bank and that mini legislature?
Well, was it 1894? No. Seems like a long time ago. It was early 70s, mid-70s.
And up to that point, what had your
late 70s.
What had been your political or civic engagement up to that point, prior to that work, if any?
Well, actually, I go back to high school. I was Speaker of the Senate for high school, right? So I'm just living on my high school dream here, and it's sort of funny, but it's true. Back then we called it a student senate, but I was the speaker of that. And so I've been thinking about public policy pretty much from as early as I can remember, mainly because my parents, back then in the old days, you actually could have dinner with your family. Nowadays, people are so busy, it's hard to actually sit down and
this really was in the
talk
1890s.
things over. Yeah, right, exactly. This is in the 50s and 60s, and so when we'd get together for dinner practically every night, we'd always talk about politics, almost invariably. And so I've got very fond memories of my family, vigorously talking about issues.
Were they themselves engaged directly in politics, or just active citizens who were wanting to understand the news and such?
Well, my dad in particular, and my mom as well, were like the PTA president, a member of the state or the Kitsap County Good Roads Association, a variety of things like that. So they were heavily involved in local community life. And my dad actually ran for the school board over in Bremerton, but as a shipyard worker, electrician, he didn't have the resources to win. But he instilled in me, as well as my mom instilled in me, a real love of public service and giving back to the community, and then getting involved in politics as a positive experience rather than a cynical experience.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Who else, if you think back to those early years, formed your sense of not just the idea that you should serve, but your actual values around these progressive ideals that you've been talking about?
I don't know. I had this very interesting discussion with my dad many years ago. where he was telling some people at the dinner table, I'd be spouting about some politics, and my dad turned to them and says, "I don't know where he got all that." So, I don't know.
Disavowed responsibility.
Well, it's convenient. That particular issue he did. I don't know. It's just a variety of things. I feel really strongly for the underdog. And part of that is my family's history. My dad and fathers worked in the coal mines over in Roslyn, Washington. And to this day, we've got problems with anything dealing with coal companies, for example, just because of how they treated working people back then. Things are a lot different now, obviously, but we really believe in fighting for the working families of our state, standing up for the right to collectively bargain as a union, to also be out there in terms of standing up for yourself and for your fellow working people.
So that wanting to side with the underdog is one aspect. Obviously, to have been engaged in political things from such a young age, you must have had a taste for combat in a way. I mean, not actual combat, but a taste for just the rough and tumble of things. Was that also something that your parents had modeled, or where did that come from?
Well,
your desire to be in the fray?
My parents insisted that I play Pee-wee football, so maybe that's what it all came about. I don't know. Yeah, it's a great experience playing Pee-wee football. I really enjoyed that, and to this day, I still meet people that I actually played with way back when.
You're not kidding?
No, I'm not kidding you. In fact, the first time I ran in '94, I walk into the machinist hall for the machinist union, which was probably the biggest union at the time. And I walk in there, and this guy comes up to me, this big, bulky guy, right? He says to me, "Are you Frank Chopp from Bremerton?" I said, "Yeah. Who are you?" I actually said, "Who the hell are you?" And he said, "I'm Bruce Spalding." And he was the tight end on the North Perry Pee Wee football. But back then, we were all pretty scrawny because we were Pee Wee football players. Well, now he's like, very muscular, and it was actually an officer in the machinist union. I hadn't seen him for 35 years, something like that.
Who else have been your mentors or people who have shaped you along the way in terms of your political education?
Oh, it's been a very fortunate experience to actually have gotten to know a lot of great people in public office, and public life, rather, I shouldn't say public office. George Scarola is one name that comes to mind. You know George, and he and I have worked together on countless projects over the years. He's been a great advisor and also co-worker on things. We're so proud, actually, this week that his efforts, among with many others, succeeded in terms of having simple majority for school levies. So yet another project we worked together on. My wife, in particular, has also been extremely helpful. You should have seen me before I met her. Jeez.
And this is Nancy Long.
Nancy Long, yeah, wonderful person.
Service Corps.
Yeah, she's great, and she's really not only kept me grounded, which sounds sort of trite, but it actually has really changed me.
How so?
I think in terms of, that's a good question, actually, in a lot of ways. One of which is to get my act together, and even to the point of, like, what do I wear as clothes? You should have seen me beforehand. It was not a pretty sight. But also in terms of really focusing in on how people can work together to do good things for the community. For example, I first met her, I don't know if I want to admit this, but I met her at a public hearing. And I fell in love with her.
Romantic.
Oh, well, it was great, actually, because she was basically berating the mayor's office way back when on funding for community health clinics. And the mayor at that time actually came through and was a big supporter of community health clinics, but they were arguing about it. I just thought it was pretty cool to stand up to the powers that be and advocate for community clinics to help poor people have decent health care, among other things that attracted me to her.
So George Scarola, your wife, who else has shaped you in your values and your ways of moving?
I think my brother and sisters made it. I was sort of the last kid, basically. There were 4 kids in my family. My brothers and sisters are all older than I am by quite a large number of years. So I got lucky. I sort of had the benefits of the family having a little bit more resources, so they all sort of doted on me for a while. So I grew up in a very fortunate situation. And that really made a difference. Plus, one of my sisters, actually all my brothers and sisters are teachers. So I used to joke that whenever we'd have a family reunion, it really was a teachers union meeting to lobby me on various education issues. But But also, one of my sisters is very involved in the arts and in creativity. So she always encouraged me to take some risks and be creative. And another sister of mine, through personal experience, was a great advocate on mental illness. And so in part because of her and my wife, Nancy, I became much more knowledgeable about mental health issues and how crazy it was, literally, to have a dual system where if you had a physical ailment, oh yeah, we'll take care of you. But if you got a mental ailment, oh no, that's considered askance. You shouldn't, be getting treated for that. So we changed that, by the way, in the legislature. We got mental health parity now, in part because of my sister's advocacy, as well as a lot of other folks in the community. Another name that comes to mind, actually, because of that issue, is Randy Revelle. He used to be county executive and used to be on the Seattle City Council. And he and I used to tussle when I was a rabble-rouser from the neighborhoods in the old days. But but that's the great thing about Seattle, is that we may have tussled 25, 30 years ago over some, I don't even know what it was anymore. Oh, I remember it was the city council pay raise. But then, flash forward many years, we're working together like this on health care for kids and mental health parity and a lot of other things. And I have a lot of admiration for Randy.
You mentioned a sister who opened your eyes not only to the arts in general, but to creativity and taking risks. And what are some of the risks that you feel like you took in part because of that influence?
All sorts of them. In the legislative arena, I really took a major risk by standing up to the Bechtel Corporation on public financing for toll road, the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, that had been passed by the legislature to be a privately financed toll bridge, which I knew was a complete, utterly bad for the average person out there, the toll payer. And so I stood up to them and stopped them from doing that and won. And now everybody's saying, well, what a great project that was. But early on when I took them on, the Bechtel company is not a small company. They're the second largest construction company in the world. Have you ever heard of Iraq, by the way? They've got some contracts over there. Yeah, and so for me to stand up to them and fight for the average person who had to pay the tolls for that new bridge was not easy. But I won because in part because I knew I was right, and they needed something to pass the legislature. But being in my position, I could say, "You ain't getting it," until we do public financing, which saved $1 billion in money that the toll payers would have normally had to pay under private financing.
Now, you preface this example by saying in the legislative arena. What about a risk that you feel like you've taken outside the legislative
I'll give you an
arena?
example. This is a good story, actually, I hope, for you. It was the Sandpoint. When the Sandpoint Naval Air Station was declared surplus by the federal government, this was in the 1980s, and we basically, there was a federal law that Mike Lowry had passed when he was in Congress, which basically said that if you had surplus federal property, the first preference for it is to go to help the homeless. Because at that time, this was after the Reagan budget cuts, so there was a lot of concern about the growing number of homeless people and families in the mid-'80s. And so he passed this legislation, and a few years later, we utilized it to say, well, Sandpoint Naval Air Station is surplus, and so some of it ought to be used for housing. Well, I don't know if you've ever been to a community meeting with about 500 people in the stands, basically pretty much mad at you, because what do you mean you want to put homeless people in our community? But the great thing about the community was that they were open-minded, and if you responded to their concerns, they came around and said, okay, we'll give it a shot, and it's proven to be successful. But also, what I learned was you got to figure out not only do the right thing, but what the message is and who the messenger is. For example, prior to that time, I don't know if I'd ever even owned a suit, so I wore a suit. Then plus my daughter was a baby, real infant. So one of the meetings, I really enjoyed this, I brought her in these baby carriers, right? And so it was like 400 or 500 people in the audience, sort of like tense, like wanting to, ask some tough questions about the homeless, And I brought, I was dressed in a suit. I brought my daughter, and I put her up on the table. And after that, people said, "Ooh, good." It totally softened the crowd to the point where somebody suggested that I must have rented the kid.
That's right. It wasn't your baby.
It was really my daughter. And I was really, feeding her the formula there as the meeting progressed. But if we break down the barriers between people and realize that people are human beings trying to do the right thing, it helps a lot.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that strikes me about your approach to thing about politics is so much of it is grounded in real stories, in real places, real communities. It's not this big abstract debate. Do you feel like, as you think about the way politics has unfolded in our state, in our country over the last couple of decades now, that it's harder actually across political party lines to really get to know someone else's story, get to know the other person on the other side as a human being rather than just a member of the the other party? Is it harder today than it was?
No, I think it's easier, actually, at the state level in Washington State. That's not the case nationally. They have these warring camps, which are, I mean, I just can't believe it. That's part of the reason why the congressional approval rating is really, really low, because they see all this partisan bickering. In our state, luckily, our approval rating is a lot better. In fact, the best I've ever seen it, actually, in part because we emphasize one Washington, pushing a positive and progressive agenda that's got a part of populism in there, as well as getting done on time and getting the work done.
Now, we started this conversation, we were joking about you spend 15% of your time apologizing, to people, whether or not you actually...
Well, how much time? Wait a minute, I haven't apologized yet.
That's 3 minutes here. What's an instance of a mistake you feel like you've made in public life from which you have learned, whether or not you ended up having publicly to apologize for, but just something that you think about as, that was a mistake I really learned from it. It was a pivotal, at the time maybe it was really unpleasant or painful to have made the mistake, but now I look back and it shaped the way I lead in a constructive way.
Oh, partly is it, well, it has to do with, I get so passionate about stuff or so wrapped around things that I get too emotional sometimes, and that means getting sometimes angry if things are not going quite right. And so I still have some anger here and there, but it's a lot better than it used to be, in large part because it's much more effective to try to work with people, person to person. But I still get every once in a while just frustrated, either because of the time pressure, I got so many meetings I got to get to, or I'm not satisfied with the progress of certain issues and all that sometimes I get too emotional about things. On the other hand, emotion is a very positive thing, but you got to make sure you don't disrespect people or overreact or things like that. So I've learned many times through that process. So I've gotten a lot better, but it's still concerning.
Do you feel like when you were talking about some of the people who have shaped you along the way, it's interesting. One of the first names you mentioned is George Scarola, who was working for you, in fact. And it's not often the case that you ask people in public life or in any leadership role who's shaped them. They'll often point to someone else who'd been in a leadership role before them and had been somewhere else. Oh. It's not often that people think about, well, people who are nominally working for me, and I'm learning from them. Do you think that is an ethic? Where did you get that ethic of you learn from everybody around you, whatever their title is, wherever they are in the org chart?
Well, I pay attention to people doing the work. People in public office, they work hard, but the vast bulk of the work is done by other people, both other members of the legislature, but also staff and whatnot, and also community organizations too. So when I look at the situation, I try to figure out, okay, who's actually doing the work? And so in so many cases, it's people I work with or technically work for me, whatever that quote is. Another example is Mike and Reichert, who's my chief of staff. She's wonderful, very organized, very driven, very positive about an agenda, very hardworking. And I'm sitting there saying, thank God I've got her as a chief of staff for our caucus, because she really makes things happen. And I really have great admiration for people who focus in on getting the job done.
You've been at this work as Speaker for nearly a decade, as you say, in the legislature since '94. If you scroll forward another 10, 15 years, do you imagine yourself remaining in this kind of role and this kind of work, or do you feel like, no, there's another act for you out there, another chapter that involves doing some other kind of service and work?
I don't know how I could get much better than being in a position as Speaker, so I don't have any ambitions for running for something else. It's a very unique situation. We've got a good majority, we have a constructive majority, we have a great agenda that we're passing, getting a lot of stuff done. I mean, is there anything better in public life? I mean, really, I feel very fortunate to be where I am. In fact, I still joke, I can't believe I'm actually elected to the legislature. I mean, people actually voted for me. I mean, I was shocked, and then to be a Speaker, and then for 10 years, it's like, this is strange. I mean, I enjoy it, but it's very unique, and I very much appreciate it.
You know, one of the things, I mean, you talk about the two sides of the coin there. One is having the palpable passion that you have, and sometimes, as you say, you got to channel those emotions and so that they're all flowing constructively. When you are looking for new folks to be, you know, whether candidates for office or just young people who you want to have work in the legislature to help develop policy and the rest, what are you, just on a gut level, what are you looking for? Is it passion first? Is it life experience of a certain kind first? I mean, is there something that is
well, basically everything. But the first one that I look for is experience in the real world. Mm-hmm. Because if you've got experience actually doing things, either in your workplace or in local government, say, or in the community, you actually have, it's a good training ground, basically. Plus, there's usually something you can point to that you've actually accomplished. And so we really mainly look for people who already have done things in life, who have real experience and could offer something. Then we look at their talents, and I'm actually extremely heartened by the quality of the talent in the legislature. You know, I'm sure there's differing opinions about, you know, who has talent and all that kind of thing, but overall I'm very, very, very pleased with the quality of the people stepping forward. You know, my goal when I first started as Speaker was to increase the quantity of House Democrats and improve the quality of the legislature, because when you look at, you want to get something done, you have to have talented people to get it done.
Well, that focus of yours on passion and purpose is something that I think people across
party
across party lines can appreciate about what you do. So thanks, Mr. Speaker, for joining us today.
Oh, great. Thanks very much.
Yeah.
Thanks.
My guest today has been Frank Chopp. He's Speaker of the House in the Washington State Legislature, and you've been watching Seattle Voices. I'm Eric Liu. Thanks for tuning in, and join us again.